On December 20th, 1987, a humid Sunday evening in the Philippines, the ferry Doña Paz prepared for yet another routine voyage. At the pier in Tacloban, Leyte, hundreds of passengers squeezed forward, carrying bundles, baskets, and bags. The air was thick with excitement and anticipation. It was just 5 days before Christmas, and for many, this trip meant reuniting with family in Manila. The Doña Paz was a familiar sight in these waters. Launched in 1963 in Japan, she had been renamed and repurposed over the years before being acquired by Sulpicio Lines, one of the Philippines' largest shipping companies. To locals, she was simply a reliable floating bus, ferrying workers, students, and families between islands. Few passengers knew, or cared, that she had once been called the Himiyori Maru and had already served decades at sea. What mattered was that she got them where they needed to go. But on this night, the ferry was far from ordinary. Though her legal capacity was 1,518 passengers, witnesses estimate that over 4,000 people crowded on board. Ticketing was loose, lists were incomplete, and enforcement was non-existent. For every person with a cabin ticket, there were 2 or 3 more crammed into hallways, staircases, and cargo holds. Passengers sprawled on the decks, squeezed into corners, and even perched on the roof of the ferry just to find a place to rest. A survivor later recalled, "You could not walk. You could not stretch your legs. People were everywhere, on the floors, on the stairways, even blocking the exits." Yet for those traveling, this was normal. Overcrowding was common on Philippine ferries, and passengers had grown used to it. The ship was alive with sound, children laughing, radios playing Christmas songs, vendors calling out snacks for sale. For many, the atmosphere was festive. After all, this was the journey home. Parents imagined the joy of surprising children with gifts. Workers dreamed of long-awaited rest. Students looked forward to family reunions. But beneath this sense of holiday cheer, the Doña Paz was a disaster waiting to happen. The ferry was poorly maintained. Its life vests were old and insufficient in number. Lifeboats were missing or unusable. Few passengers had been given any instructions about safety procedures, and crew members did not enforce regulations. In truth, even if they had, there were nowhere near enough life-saving devices for the thousands on board. The Doña Paz was, in every sense, a floating trap. That night, the ship departed around 6:30 p.m. The waters of the Tablas Strait lay calm under a starry sky. The air was still, the sea smooth, the atmosphere deceptively peaceful. For those on board, there was no hint of the catastrophe to come. Hours into the journey, passengers began to settle in. Families huddled together on mats spread across the deck. Mothers soothed children to sleep, fanning them against the tropical heat. Men smoked cigarettes by the railings, gazing out at the vast, quiet ocean. The hum of the ship's engines provided a steady background rhythm. But if anyone had looked closely into the horizon, they might have noticed another vessel moving through the same waters, the MT Vector, an oil tanker carrying 8,800 barrels of gasoline, kerosene, and petroleum products. The Vector was smaller, poorly manned, and operating under questionable legality. It lacked proper navigational lights, making it almost invisible in the darkness. The Doña Paz sailed confidently forward, unaware of what lay ahead. Passengers drifted into dreams of Christmas mornings and family embraces, never suspecting that the night sky would soon erupt in fire. It was, on the surface, just another journey across the Philippine seas. But in reality, the Doña Paz was not a ferry that night. It was a floating coffin, overloaded, unprepared, and heading directly toward the deadliest maritime disaster of the 20th century. By 10 p.m., most passengers were asleep. The decks were quiet, save for the occasional cough, the crying of a restless child, or the creak of metal as the ferry cut through the calm waters. Crew members stood at their posts, perhaps lulled into complacency by the routine of countless identical trips. Yet in less than 15 minutes, this fragile illusion of safety would be obliterated. The ferry's fate, and the fate of thousands of souls, was already sealed. Because unseen in the black night, the Doña Paz and the Vector were on a collision course. The ferry's passengers dreamed of home. Instead, they were sailing into history's most horrifying ferry disaster. By the late evening of December 20th, 1987, the Doña Paz was well underway, carrying thousands of passengers across the Tablas Strait. On paper, the ship's maximum legal capacity was 1,518 passengers plus crew. But reality that night was far different and far more dangerous. Estimates put the actual number of people aboard at over 4,300, possibly even close to 4,500. How could such a massive overloading occur? The answer lay in a mixture of corruption, negligence, and sheer desperation from passengers who needed transport in the days before Christmas. In the Philippines during the 1980s, maritime regulations were loosely enforced. Ticketing offices often sold more passes than allowed, sometimes in cooperation with shipping officials, sometimes simply ignoring restrictions. On top of that, countless passengers boarded without tickets, bribing guards or sneaking on with relatives. Others paid cash directly to crew members once on board, bypassing any official count. The result was chaos. By the time the Doña Paz left port, she was so crowded that hallways became sleeping mats, stairwells became bedrooms, and even the open-air deck was carpeted with bodies. People were shoulder to shoulder, pressed into corners. Some sat on crates or leaned against the railings with their backs to the sea, grateful simply to have a place to rest. A survivor later said, "There was no space to move. If you wanted to walk from one end of the ship to another, it was impossible. You stepped over sleeping bodies, you squeezed past families clinging together. Even the bathrooms were overflowing with people resting on the floor." The ship itself was old. Built in 1963 in Japan, she had been sold and renamed multiple times before ending up with Sulpicio lines. Though the company promoted the ferry as a safe and reliable vessel, in truth, her safety equipment was outdated or missing altogether. There were not enough life jackets. Many of the ones on board were old, damaged, or unusable. Several lifeboats had been removed entirely or left in disrepair. The ferry did not conduct safety drills, nor were passengers given instructions on what to do in case of emergency. Even worse, the massive overcrowding made any potential evacuation impossible. If an emergency struck, thousands of people would bottleneck in narrow staircases and blocked passageways. The ferry was, quite literally, a trap. But for the passengers, these dangers were invisible. People laughed, sang, and shared food. Children played tag in small open spaces. Vendors roamed, selling boiled peanuts, rice cakes, and sodas. Radios crackled with Christmas songs. To the passengers, the Doña Paz was not a coffin. It was a bridge home. A way to spend Christmas with loved ones. Yet behind the scenes, shipping critics had long referred to vessels like this as floating coffins. They were overloaded, poorly maintained, and operated with profit prioritized above safety. The Doña Paz's reputation was no different. Though many had traveled on her safely before, whispers in the maritime industry painted a darker picture. Accident waiting to happen, some called her. A disaster in waiting, said others. And still that December night, no alarm bells rang. Officials let the ferry depart. The captain followed his usual route. The crew saw no reason to worry. It was just another night at sea. But the overcrowding was an ET, just a background detail. It would play a devastating role in what was to come. When the collision happened and fire broke out, this suffocating congestion meant that escape was nearly impossible. Families were trapped in their sleeping spaces. Children were lost in the crush. People who might have reached lifeboats or jumped overboard never had the chance. The overcrowding also meant that no accurate passenger list existed. This would haunt investigators later. With thousands of unofficial travelers, no one could say for certain who was on board, or exactly how many lives had been lost. Many names were erased before they were ever recorded. As the ferry cut through the calm night waters, passengers began settling down. Mothers hushed children to sleep. Fathers smoked their last cigarettes on deck. Couples whispered to each other under the stars. The holiday spirit lingered thickly in the air. But inside the ship, the atmosphere was suffocating. The heat of so many bodies crammed together, the lack of air circulation, and the constant hum of the overworked engines created a claustrophobic environment. Sweat, oil, and salt mixed into a haze of smells. Still, for the thousands aboard, this was the price of getting home. The Doña Paz pressed steadily through the waters of the Tablas Strait, a narrow body of sea separating the islands of Tablas and Mindoro in the Philippines. It was late evening on December 20th, 1987, and the air was deceptively calm. The ocean lay almost glass-like, disturbed only by the rhythmic churn of the ferry's engines and the faint slap of waves against her hull. To the thousands on board, this night felt ordinary, even peaceful. Families gathered on the decks, enjoying the cool breeze that cut through the heat of the overcrowded cabins. Vendors balanced trays of boiled peanuts, fried bananas, and sodas, shouting above the din. Radios played softly, mostly Christmas songs, adding to the festive mood. Children giggled as they chased one another around the open deck, while couples leaned against the railings, pointing out the scattered lights of distant fishing boats. Inside, the cramped hallways buzzed with chatter, the kind of lively chaos only found on Philippine ferries during the holiday rush. But beneath the surface of this festive scene, danger lurked in silence. The Doña Paz, though steady in her movement, was carrying thousands more passengers than legally allowed. Every hallway, every stairwell, every cabin was suffocating with people. The heat inside was unbearable. Passengers fanned themselves with newspapers. The air was thick with the smells of sweat, instant noodles, kerosene lamps, and engine oil. For many, stepping outside onto the deck was the only relief. Still, despite the discomfort, there was a strange sense of comfort in numbers. People told themselves that this was normal, that ferries always looked like this at Christmas. To the poor workers returning home, the students heading to their provinces, and the families eager for reunion, the Doña Paz was not a death trap. It was hope on the water. At the helm, the captain and crew maintained their course. Visibility was reasonable, though night had settled thickly across the strait. The sky was moonless, and only the faint twinkle of distant stars guided the ship along with its navigation lights. It was the kind of night sailors considered both safe and dangerous, safe for its calmness, dangerous for its black, featureless vastness. No passenger suspected that another ship, the MT Vector, was approaching from the opposite direction, carrying a deadly cargo of gasoline and petroleum. For now, the two vessels were invisible to each other, slowly closing the gap across the dark sea. Life aboard the ferry carried on in its usual rhythm. Some passengers had started bedding down for the night, laying out mats and thin blankets wherever they could find space. Mothers soothed their crying babies, gently rocking them to sleep. Older men played cards by lantern light, slapping the table and laughing at their wins and losses. Others, exhausted by the chaos of boarding and the long journey ahead, simply curled up against walls or railings, letting the vibrations of the ship lull them to sleep. For many of the passengers, this voyage represented more than just travel. It represented homecoming. December was the most important time of the year in the Philippines. Families who had been separated by work, poverty, or distance were reunited at Christmas. The ferry was not just crowded with people, it was crowded with dreams of reunion. Fathers imagined surprising their children with gifts. Mothers longed to sit once more at the family table. Lovers whispered plans for the holidays. And yet, for all its warmth and laughter, the ship carried an unspoken unease. Old-timers knew the risks. Some passengers muttered to each other about the lack of lifeboats, the faulty life jackets, the narrow hallways jammed with sleeping bodies. A few even joked grimly about the ferry being a floating coffin. But these words were dismissed with a shrug. After all, what choice did they have? This was the only way home. By 10 p.m., the atmosphere had grown quieter. The decks thinned as families retreated inside. The hum of conversation faded into a low murmur. The ferry's engines pounded beneath the floor, steady as a heartbeat. The night had wrapped the vessel in a blanket of darkness, broken only by the glow of oil lamps and the dim navigation lights reflecting faintly on the black water. What no one could see was the Vector, loaded with nearly 9,000 barrels of petroleum, plowing its way through the strait. Unlike the ferry, the tanker was far smaller, manned by a skeleton crew, and suffering from reported mechanical and staffing issues. Some claimed later that her rudder was faulty, making maneuvering difficult. Others alleged that the Vector was not even seaworthy at the time of the voyage. The stage was quietly being set for disaster. Back on the Doña Paz, passengers drifted into sleep, unaware of the approaching danger. A few men lingered on deck, smoking and telling stories. One survivor would later recall that he stood near the railing, looking out into the vast emptiness of the sea, when he spotted a distant light. At first, he thought it was just another fishing boat. He had no idea that the light was moving fast and directly into their path. The sea remained deceptively calm. It was nearing 11 p.m. when the peace of the Tabla Strait began to fracture. The Doña Paz continued its steady course southward, her engines throbbing rhythmically beneath the decks. Most of the thousands on board had already succumbed to sleep, their bodies packed tightly in the suffocating cabins or sprawled across hallways and stairwells. On deck, only a few passengers remained awake, smoking, chatting, or gazing into the black expanse of water. Somewhere in the distance, another vessel pressed forward, the MT Vector, a small oil tanker carrying nearly 8,800 barrels of gasoline and petroleum. It was a dangerous cargo, one that demanded absolute precision and discipline. But the Vector was no model of safety. Reports later revealed it was understaffed, poorly maintained, and plagued by mechanical issues. Worse, it had no proper radio communication system to warn or coordinate with nearby vessels. On this dark night, the Vector was essentially a floating bomb. At first, the two ships were invisible to each other, each blinded by the vast emptiness of the sea. But slowly, faint lights appeared on the horizon. Lights that, to the few passengers still awake, seemed harmless. Many assumed it was just another fishing boat or a distant ferry. No one imagined that the two ships were on a deadly collision course. Inside the Doña Paz's wheelhouse, the crew maintained their navigation. Whether through miscalculation, negligence, or simply bad luck, they failed to alter their path in time. On the Vector, the small crew struggled with their steering, possibly hampered by faulty equipment. Each minute that passed drew the vessels closer, their fates bound together by the narrow corridor of the Tablas Strait. Then it happened. A sudden shudder rippled through the Doña Paz. Passengers jerked awake, confused. Metal screamed against metal as the two ships collided. The Vector had struck the ferry broadside, tearing open her hull. For a brief moment, silence followed, as though the sea itself was holding its breath. And then came the fire. The Vector's cargo, thousands of barrels of gasoline, erupted on impact. Flames shot skyward, engulfing both ships in an instant. The night sea, moments ago calm and black, exploded into a hellish inferno. Passengers who had been sleeping were jolted awake not by the collision itself, but by the searing heat and the deafening roar of fire. Within seconds, the decks of the Doña Paz became unrecognizable. Fire spread with terrifying speed, racing through the hallways, climbing the walls, consuming everything in its path. Those who had been lying in cramped cabins awoke in confusion, choking on thick black smoke. Mothers grabbed their children and screamed for help. Men battered at locked doors, desperate to find a way out. On deck, chaos erupted. Survivors later recalled that the flames seemed to appear from everywhere at once, as though the entire ship had burst into fire. Oil from the tanker spilled across the surface of the water, igniting the sea itself. The ocean was no longer a refuge but a sheet of burning death. Panic tore through the passengers. With no clear announcements, no guidance from the crew, people scrambled in every direction. Many didn't even know what had happened. They only knew they were trapped on a floating inferno. Some rushed to the lifeboats, only to find them useless or chained. Others leapt into the burning water in blind desperation, hoping against hope to escape the flames. But there was little chance of survival. The Doña Paz was not just burning. It was becoming an oven. The sheer number of people made escape impossible. Hallways clogged with terrified passengers pushing, shoving, trampling each other in a frantic bid for life. The ferry was so overcrowded that even moving through the corridors was a nightmare. For many, the fire was faster than their feet. Those who jumped into the water faced another horror. The sea was aflame with gasoline, patches of fire stretching for hundreds of feet. Survivors described swimming through darkness, choking on fumes, their skin burning as they fought to escape the fire floating on the waves. Others drowned instantly, unable to swim or dragged down by the heavy currents. Amid the terror, there were haunting moments of humanity. Parents tried to shield their children with their own bodies. Strangers linked hands, choosing to jump together rather than die alone. Some passengers clung to floating debris, calling out into the darkness for loved ones who would never answer. The Doña Paz itself was doomed from the instant of collision. Within minutes, flames had consumed nearly the entire vessel. The heat grew so intense that steel warped and glass shattered. There was no organized evacuation, only raw animal panic. Crew members vanished into the chaos. Some died instantly, others were seen jumping into the sea. For the majority of the more than 4,000 souls aboard, there was no escape. The combination of fire, smoke, and overcrowding created a death trap. Survivors later said the screams were the worst part. the endless, piercing cries of thousands of people caught between fire and water. The collision of the Doña Paz and the Vector was not just an accident. It was a perfect storm of negligence, poor safety standards, and fatal timing. In less than 20 minutes, what had been a floating city of laughter, songs, and holiday dreams was transformed into a scene from hell. When the flames finally consumed the ferry, the night sky glowed red over the Tablas Strait. And where once there had been thousands of voices, the sea fell silent again, broken only by the crackle of burning oil and the distant cries of a handful of survivors drifting in the water. The greatest peacetime maritime disaster in history had unfolded in mere moments, and almost no one lived to tell the tale. The Doña Paz was no longer a ship. It was a furnace, a towering torch of steel and wood blazing against the black backdrop of the Philippine night. From miles away, fishermen would later recall seeing the horizon glow, as if the sun itself had risen in the wrong direction. For those aboard, however, there was no awe, only terror. The fire, born from the ruptured tanks of the Vector, raced through the ferry with a speed that defied belief. Gasoline vapors ignited the air itself, filling corridors and cabins with flames before passengers could even comprehend what was happening. Some survivors said the flames moved faster than people could run, a living wall of fire that chased them wherever they turned. Inside the lower decks, panic reached unbearable levels. Families awoke choking on smoke, their cabins filling with acrid fumes. Mothers clutched their children, screaming for exits that were nowhere to be found. Many of the interior doors were locked or blocked by the crush of human bodies trying to escape. In the narrow corridors, hundreds of people became trapped, their pounding fists and cries for help swallowed by the roar of fire. Above deck, the scene was equally catastrophic. Flames leapt from the superstructure, turning the once white-painted ferry into a skeleton of fire. People poured out onto the decks in every direction, blinded by smoke, their skin blistering from the heat. Survivors described the air as unbreathable, searing the lungs with each gasp. The very oxygen seemed to burn. And then there was the water. To escape the flames, many leapt overboard. But the ocean below was no refuge. The spilled gasoline from the Vector had spread across the surface, igniting the very sea around the ship. Survivors described a nightmare unlike any other, jumping from fire above into fire below. Some caught between the two simply froze, unable to choose, consumed where they stood. Those who dared the jump hit the water with a scream, only to discover the surface ablaze. They had to swim under the fire, holding their breath and forcing themselves deeper, praying to rise in a pocket of dark water where the flames had not spread. Some never came back up. Others surfaced only to find the fire waiting, clinging to them like a living creature, burning skin and hair in seconds. The cries echoed across the night. "Help me! My children! God, save us!" The voices of thousands rose in one terrible chorus, but few answers came. The sea was littered with debris, burning oil, and desperate passengers thrashing for life. Men fought to cling to floating planks, while others, weakened by burns and smoke, slipped beneath the surface forever. Among the chaos, there were moments of desperate bravery. Some parents pushed their children into the water first, sacrificing their own lives in the flames so their children might stand a chance of survival. Strangers clung together, shouting encouragement, trying to swim away from the inferno. Survivors recalled clutching hands in the water, only to feel the grip loosen as exhaustion claimed another life. The fire on the Doña Paz raged with such intensity that it lit the strait for miles. Fishermen and coastal villagers saw the glow and the towering columns of smoke, but most were powerless to intervene. They had no ships capable of carrying thousands, no equipment to fight an oil fire at sea. Many could only watch, helpless, as a nightmare unfolded on the horizon. On board, there was no organized response. The crew had vanished into the panic, some killed instantly, others seen abandoning ship. Lifeboats, already insufficient for the number of passengers, were either destroyed by fire or inaccessible in the chaos. Passengers who tried to lower them burned or were trampled in the attempt. Most people never even saw a life jacket. The minutes ticked by like hours. For those in the water, survival became a matter of endurance. The burning oil clung to the skin, searing flesh. The Doña Paz was gone. What had moments before been a blazing inferno, lighting up the sea like a second sun, had finally collapsed into the depths of the Tablas Strait. The water hissed as burning debris sank, leaving behind scattered patches of fire floating on the surface. Where once a ship carried over 4,000 souls, there was now only wreckage, oil, and silence. At first, the silence was deceptive. Survivors, those who had managed to leap clear of the burning decks or swim past the floating gasoline fires, still called out into the darkness. Their voices carried across the black water, weak, broken, desperate. Some cried out for family members, others prayed, while many simply screamed for help that would never come. The cries rose and fell, carried by the wind, until they blended into the night like a mournful chorus. But as the hours stretched on, the voices grew fewer. Exhaustion, burns, injuries, and the merciless pull of the sea claimed them one by one. Those clinging to floating debris found their strength failing. Some slipped beneath the waves quietly, their hands loosening from the planks or lifebuoys. Others fought until the last moment, thrashing against the inevitable. For the survivors, the horror did not end with the flames. The sea around them was littered with corpses, men, women, and children floating side by side, many burned beyond recognition. The smell of burning fuel mixed with the stench of death. Oil coated the water, slicking survivors' hair and skin, stinging their eyes, choking their throats when they tried to speak. Every movement was a struggle. Every breath was agony. Imagine floating in that blackness. No land in sight. No rescue ships on the horizon. Only the occasional crackle of fire on the water and the distant splash of something sinking. Survivors later said the silence was worse than the screams. It was the sound of despair, an emptiness that told them they had been abandoned. Hours passed. Midnight turned to 1 a.m., then 2. Survivors clung desperately to life, their minds swinging between hope and hopelessness. Some imagined lights in the distance, praying they were ships. Others began hallucinating, their bodies weakened by exhaustion and burns. Parents who had jumped with children now found themselves holding lifeless bodies, sobbing into the darkness. Strangers who had clung together let go, one by one. Meanwhile, on the nearby islands, fishermen and coastal villagers had seen the fireball in the night sky. Some tried to sail toward it, but their small wooden boats were no match for the inferno. Many feared the burning sea and stayed back, unwilling to risk their own lives. Others thought the flames would surely draw larger rescue ships, that someone, somewhere, must already be on the way. But help was far slower than anyone imagined. In truth, the outside world knew almost nothing. The Doña Paz had no functioning radio, no proper distress system. The Vector, crippled by fire, also failed to send a proper SOS. For hours after the collision, the Philippine Coast Guard remained unaware that the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history was unfolding in their waters. While survivors struggled in the sea, officials sat in silence, oblivious. And so, the night dragged on. Survivors floated in clusters, their numbers dwindling. Some prayed aloud, whispering rosaries, their voices trembling. Others cursed the ferry company, the crew, or fate itself. A few fell into eerie quiet, staring blankly at the stars above as though waiting for death to take them. The psychological torment was unbearable. To drift for hours surrounded by burning oil and bodies, listening as voices grew fewer and fewer, was a trauma no survivor would ever forget. By dawn, the sea told a story of almost unimaginable loss. The morning light revealed the true scale of the disaster. A vast slick of oil, charred wreckage, and the lifeless forms of thousands of passengers floating in silence. The survivors, their skin blistered from burns, their bodies weakened by smoke inhalation and fatigue, still clung to pieces of wreckage. Some were barely conscious, whispering for water or help. And still, no rescue ships had arrived. It was not until several hours after sunrise that small fishing boats cautiously approached. They pulled a handful of survivors from the water, their boats nearly capsizing from the weight. For the fishermen, it was a nightmare beyond comprehension. They had set out expecting to catch fish, not to find themselves in the middle of a floating graveyard. Some wept as they pulled oil-soaked men and women onto their boats, realizing there was little they could do for the thousands they could not save. By the time official rescue vessels finally reached the area, the disaster was already over. The Doña Paz was gone. The Vector was destroyed. and thousands of lives had been extinguished in less than a single night. In the end, out of more than 4,300 people, only 26 survivors were officially recorded. 24 were passengers from the Doña Paz. 2 came from the Vector. When the first official reports of the Doña Paz tragedy reached the Philippine authorities on the morning of December 20th, 1987, disbelief rippled through the nation. At first, the news was fragmentary. A ferry had collided with an oil tanker, and there were casualties. But as hours passed, the magnitude of what had happened began to surface. By midday, the staggering numbers became clear. The Doña Paz had been carrying far more passengers than its official manifest suggested. Instead of 1,500, the number legally allowed, the ferry was overloaded with more than 4,000 people. Entire families, Christmas travelers, students, laborers, mothers carrying infants, crowded aboard with little thought to safety, because such conditions had long been the norm in the archipelago's ferry system. Now, almost all of them were gone. News outlets scrambled to cover the disaster. Images of burned wreckage and oil-slicked bodies filled front pages. Television screens showed grieving relatives gathering at ports and hospitals, clutching faded photographs of their loved ones, begging for confirmation. Reporters tried to ask survivors what had happened, but most were too traumatized to speak. Those who did gave harrowing accounts. Fire everywhere, screams in the dark, people leaping into burning seas. The death toll stunned the world. With more than 4,300 lives lost, the sinking of the Doña Paz instantly became the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history, surpassing even infamous tragedies like the Titanic. Yet for the families directly affected, it wasn't a statistic. It was a personal apocalypse. Towns and villages across the Philippines awoke to the news that dozens, sometimes entire households, were gone. Some communities lost so many people that funerals stretched on for weeks. In the capital, Manila, grief turned quickly to anger. Questions poured in. Why had the ferry been allowed to carry so many passengers? Why was there no functioning radio to call for help? Where were the lifeboats, the life jackets, the emergency drills? Why had rescue vessels taken so long to arrive? Every answer pointed not to fate, but to failure. Human, systemic, institutional failure. The owners of the Doña Paz, Sulpicio lines, came under immediate fire. Families accused the company of sacrificing safety for profit, cramming as many paying passengers as possible into a ship that had no chance of saving them in an emergency. Survivors testified that lifeboats were chained, life jackets locked away, and crew nowhere to be found when the disaster struck. The Vector's operators also faced criticism. The tanker had been operating with faulty equipment, inadequate staffing, and without a proper license to transport its dangerous cargo. For ordinary Filipinos, the tragedy revealed the ugly truth about the maritime industry. It was riddled with corruption, negligence, and impunity. Ferries sailed overloaded almost daily. Inspections were cursory at best, and safety rules were rarely enforced. The Doña Paz disaster was not just an accident. It was the predictable result of a system where profit outweighed human life. But for the families of victims, blame was a secondary concern to grief. Thousands gathered at ports and morgues, desperate to identify remains. Yet the fire had burned so hot that most bodies were unrecognizable, charred beyond recognition. Only a few hundred were ever formally identified. For many families, there was nothing. No body, no grave, only the haunting knowledge that their loved ones had been swallowed by the sea. Mothers wept as they clutched children's toys found among the wreckage. Wives collapsed at the docks as officials read out lists of survivors that contained none of their husbands' names. The scale of suffering defied imagination. The government declared days of mourning, lowering flags to half-mast. But the gestures felt hollow to many. The grief was too deep, the anger too raw. In newspapers, editorials demanded accountability. Priests in Sunday sermons called the disaster a national sin, evidence of a society that had neglected the value of life. Activists marched holding placards with slogans like 4,000 souls, no justice, and never again. International reaction was swift as well. Headlines around the world labeled the Doña Paz the Asian Titanic and the world's deadliest ferry disaster. Yet unlike the Titanic, with its myths of elegance and hubris, the Doña Paz evoked only horror and shame. There was no iceberg, no act of God, only human greed and neglect. The foreign press highlighted the poverty that had driven so many to board the ferry despite its overcrowding, and the lack of enforcement that had allowed such conditions to continue unchecked. For survivors, the days after were a blur of trauma. Many lay in hospital beds, their bodies burned, lungs scarred from smoke, eyes haunted by what they had seen. They spoke of being surrounded by fire in the water, of losing family members before their eyes, of clinging to wreckage for hours while listening to thousands of voices fade into silence. For some, survival brought not relief, but guilt. The agonizing question of why they had lived, while so many others had perished. In the weeks that followed, official investigations began. Commissions were formed, hearings held, promises made. The government vowed reforms, stricter inspections, harsher penalties, better safety standards. Sulpizio lines insisted they were not to blame, pointing fingers at the Vector. The owners of the tanker argued otherwise. Lawsuits flew, but for the grieving, justice felt distant, almost meaningless. No verdict could bring back the dead. Yet the tragedy left scars that would never fade. For years afterward, December 20th was remembered not as a holiday season, but as a day of mourning. Families continued to light candles for the lost, whispering their names into the night. Survivors avoided ferries whenever possible, unable to step aboard without hearing echoes of the screams. Children who had lost parents grew up carrying the weight of absence, their lives forever shaped by a night of fire and silence. The Doña Paz disaster was not just a maritime accident. It was a national trauma, a collective wound etched into the soul of the Philippines. It revealed the fragility of human life in the face of negligence, and the devastating cost of forgetting that every passenger, every ticket sold represents a living soul. When the smoke cleared and the last bodies were laid to rest, one truth remained. The deadliest ferry disaster in history had not occurred in a storm, nor in war, nor in some act of nature. It had happened in peacetime, on a calm night, in a country that had failed its people. And the memory of those 4,300 lives lost would forever haunt the nation. In the immediate aftermath of the Doña Paz tragedy, the nation's grief quickly turned into outrage, and with that outrage came demands for answers. How could a ferry carrying thousands of passengers collide with an oil tanker on a calm night? Why had there been no distress call, no proper rescue operation, and, most damning of all, why had so many passengers been allowed aboard in the first place? Government officials, under enormous public pressure, launched formal investigations within days. Multiple agencies became involved: the Philippine Coast Guard, the Board of Marine Inquiry, BMI, the Department of Transportation, and later, even international maritime organizations. Each body sought to piece together a puzzle clouded by conflicting testimony, missing records, and corporate denials. The first revelation was explosive. According to the official passenger manifest, only 1,583 people were listed on the Doña Paz. But survivor accounts and reports from port authorities suggested the ship had been carrying over 4,300 passengers, nearly 3 times its legal capacity. Families who lost loved ones confirmed this, pointing out that most passengers had not been issued tickets, but had boarded through informal channels, a common but illegal practice at the time. This meant that thousands of deaths were unrecorded on official documents, as if they had never existed. Investigators soon uncovered further negligence. The Doña Paz had not carried a functioning radio, leaving the crew unable to send out a distress signal during the collision. Even more shocking, many lifeboats were inoperable, rusted, or chained in place. Life jackets, the survivors claimed, were either locked away or so few in number that only a tiny fraction of the passengers could have used them. In essence, the ship had been sailing as a floating coffin long before the collision sealed its fate. Attention then shifted to the Vector, the oil tanker that had collided with the ferry. Records revealed that the Vector was operating with outdated navigation equipment and was manned by an underqualified crew. Worse, it was discovered that the tanker did not have the proper license to carry 8,800 barrels of petroleum products, the highly flammable cargo that ignited into an inferno after the crash. Eyewitness accounts suggested that the Vector's navigation lights were either dim or absent, making it almost invisible to the Doña Paz in the darkness. Faced with these facts, the Board of Marine Inquiry placed the primary blame on the Vector and its owners, Vector Shipping. According to their findings, the tanker's crew had been negligent, its equipment substandard, and its operations unlawful. However, this conclusion was far from universally accepted. Critics argued that the Doña Paz's operators, Sulpicio Lines bore equal, if not greater, responsibility. After all, it was their vessel that was dangerously overcrowded, unprepared for emergencies, and ill-equipped to save lives. The investigations revealed an uncomfortable truth. This was not a simple accident with a single point of failure. It was a catastrophic system failure involving both companies and the regulatory bodies that had allowed unsafe practices to flourish. Ferry operators had long been notorious for ignoring safety standards, while government agencies routinely turned a blind eye. Corruption, bribery, and inefficiency had created an environment where disaster was not only possible, but inevitable. As the hearings dragged on, families of the victims sought justice through the courts. Class action lawsuits were filed against Sulpicio Lines, Vector Shipping, and the oil company that owned the cargo, Caltex Philippines. Lawyers representing victims. Families argued that Sulpicio had knowingly endangered lives by allowing rampant overcrowding and by failing to maintain basic safety equipment. They also accused the company of attempting to downplay the true scale of the tragedy by sticking to the official manifest numbers. But legal battles proved long and grueling. Sulpicio Lines, one of the most powerful shipping companies in the Philippines, employed high-powered attorneys who argued that the Doña Paz had been the victim of the Vector S recklessness. They insisted their ferry had been seaworthy and placed the full blame on the tanker. Vector Shipping, in turn, was a small and underfunded company that struggled to defend itself, but it too tried to deflect responsibility, pointing to poor visibility and claiming the Doña Paz's crew had not acted swiftly enough. For years, the court cases dragged on. The victims' families, many of whom were poor, found themselves caught in a web of bureaucracy, legal technicalities, and corporate stonewalling. Some received token compensation, but it was meager compared to the magnitude of their loss. For the majority, there was no meaningful restitution, only the bitter memory of loved ones lost to a preventable disaster. International observers also criticized the Philippines for its handling of the case. Reports from maritime experts noted that such a massive loss of life should have spurred sweeping reforms in safety regulations, yet little was done in the immediate aftermath. Ferries continued to sail overloaded, and inspections remained lax. To the outside world, the Doña Paz tragedy seemed like a warning ignored. Still, some symbolic victories were achieved. In 1999, after years of litigation, the Philippine Supreme Court upheld a ruling that placed responsibility on the Vector and its owners. The judgment ordered Vector Shipping to compensate victims' families, but by then the company had long gone bankrupt, leaving little money to distribute. Sulpicio Lines, despite public condemnation, managed to survive as a business, continuing to operate ferries for decades afterward, though it would later be implicated in other maritime accidents. For the families, the investigations and trials brought little closure. Most never saw a cent of compensation, nor did they feel justice had been served. As one grieving father put it in a newspaper interview, "They debate about whose fault it was, but what about my children? They are gone. No money, no apology can bring them back." In truth, the legal battles surrounding the Doña Paz disaster highlighted a painful reality. In many maritime tragedies, the victims are poor, the companies powerful, and justice elusive. The laws existed, but enforcement was weak. The courts functioned, but the process was slow and uneven. By the time rulings were made, most families had already been forced to move on with their lives, their grief compounded by the sense that the system had failed them twice, first on the sea and then on land. The story of the Doña Paz's aftermath was not only about blame or accountability, it was about the gaping divide between those who profited from unsafe systems and those who suffered their consequences. It was about ordinary Filipinos whose voices were drowned out by corporations, whose losses were reduced to numbers, and whose pain never truly found recognition in the halls of justice. The investigations may have ended, the legal cases may have closed, but the shadow of injustice lingered. For many survivors and relatives, the tragedy of the Doña Paz was not just the collision and fire of December 20th, 1987. It was the decades of neglect, corruption, and betrayal that both caused and followed it. The tragedy of the Doña Paz was not only a story of a shipwreck, it became a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities, corruption, and inefficiencies of the maritime system in the Philippines. While the world looked on in horror at the sheer scale of the disaster, more than 4,300 lives lost, it also raised urgent questions. Would this be the turning point? Would governments, companies, and international maritime authorities finally learn from the catastrophe? Initially, there was hope that the disaster would force sweeping reforms. The enormity of the loss was impossible to ignore. Media outlets worldwide described it as the Titanic of Asia, and comparisons to other maritime tragedies filled headlines. Unlike the Titanic of 1912, however, the Doña Paz was not struck by an iceberg. It was brought down by human negligence, greed, and complacency. For many Filipinos, this was the most bitter truth of all. Immediate reactions and political promises. In the weeks after the tragedy, the Philippine government publicly vowed to tighten maritime safety. Officials declared that ferries would be more strictly regulated, inspections would become mandatory, and passenger manifests would be more closely monitored. Politicians visited grieving families, offering condolences and promising change. The incident also caught the attention of international organizations like the International Maritime Organization, IMO, which expressed concern about the poor enforcement of safety standards in Southeast Asia. But promises, as many survivors quickly realized, are easy to make and hard to keep. Within months, ferry overcrowding was once again commonplace. Reports surfaced of inspectors turning a blind eye in exchange for bribes. For ordinary passengers, little had changed, and ferry travel remained one of the most dangerous modes of transportation in the country. Impact on the shipping industry. Sulpicio Lines, the operator of the Doña Paz, initially faced public outrage. Many called for the company's closure, arguing that its negligence had cost thousands of lives. Yet, astonishingly, Sulpicio not only survived, but continued to dominate the Philippine ferry industry for decades afterward. This survival was partly due to weak regulatory enforcement, and partly because the demand for affordable ferry travel remained high in an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands. However, the company's reputation never fully recovered. The name Sulpicio became synonymous with maritime disaster. The Doña Paz was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Sulpicio ferries would be involved in other deadly accidents, most notably the 2008 sinking of the Princess of the Stars, which claimed over 800 lives. For many Filipinos, this pattern of repeated disasters highlighted the failure to truly learn from the Doña Paz. Safety reforms and new standards. Despite these failings, the tragedy did lead to some reforms. Passenger manifests were required to be more strictly enforced, though illegal boarding remained a problem. The Coast Guard was tasked with conducting more frequent inspections, and international standards for ferry safety began to influence local regulations. One of the most important reforms was the emphasis on safety drills and equipment checks. In theory, every vessel was now required to carry enough life jackets and lifeboats for its passengers, and crews were expected to train for emergency situations. The absence of these measures on the Doña Paz had been a major factor in the scale of the loss. Yet, as survivors pointed out, reforms on paper did not always translate into reforms at sea. Enforcement was patchy, and corruption often eroded the impact of new laws. Cultural and social legacy. Beyond regulations, the Doña Paz disaster left a profound scar on Filipino society. Almost every family in certain provinces had lost someone aboard the ship, creating what many called a generation of grief. For survivors, the trauma was lifelong. Many could not bear to travel by sea again, while others carried guilt for having lived when entire families had perished. The tragedy also reinforced a bitter truth: those who died were mostly poor. Wealthier Filipinos and foreigners rarely traveled by overcrowded ferries. They could afford safer options. The Doña Paz, therefore, was not just a maritime disaster, but a class tragedy, an example of how systemic neglect disproportionately affects the most vulnerable. In cultural memory, the disaster became a symbol of neglect. Songs, poems, and even films referenced the event, often as a cautionary tale about greed and corruption. For Filipinos, it was not just a shipwreck, but a reminder of how systems fail ordinary people. International attention globally, the Doña Paz shocked maritime experts. Many compared it to the Titanic, but with an even greater death toll. While the Titanic's loss had reshaped international maritime law in 1914 through the creation of the Solis Convention, Safety of Life at Sea, the Doña Paz did not spark the same global reforms. Instead, it was largely treated as a regional issue, despite being the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. This lack of international pressure was deeply frustrating for survivors and advocates, who felt that if the disaster had occurred in the West, it might have triggered far more significant reforms. Legacy of injustice. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Doña Paz was not just the lives lost, but the sense of injustice that lingered. Families received little or no compensation, companies evaded full accountability, and government reforms proved inadequate. The disaster became a symbol of how the powerful escape blame while the powerless suffer the consequences. For decades afterward, survivors and advocacy groups pushed for recognition, memorials, and greater accountability. Some memorial services were held, but many felt they were symbolic gestures rather than meaningful acts of justice. The haunting absence of closure made the Doña Paz more than just a maritime story. It became a national wound. Why the world forgot. One of the strangest aspects of the Doña Paz legacy is how little known it is outside the Philippines. Ask most people around the world about maritime disasters, and they will name the Titanic. A few might recall the Lusitania or the Costa Concordia. But the Doña Paz, despite being the deadliest, remains largely forgotten. Why? Part of the answer lies in media coverage. In 1987, global communication networks were not as instantaneous as they are today. Another factor is the socioeconomic status of the victims. Poor, largely anonymous passengers whose deaths did not make international headlines in the same way as wealthier victims might have. Finally, the lack of a dramatic wreck, like the Titanic lying on the ocean floor, meant that the Doña Paz never entered the same cultural imagination. The lessons that remain. Despite being overshadowed by other disasters, the Doña Paz remains a cautionary tale for maritime safety. It teaches that technology alone cannot prevent disaster if greed, corruption, and negligence dominate. It highlights the importance of strong governance, transparency, and accountability. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds the world that the value of human life must never be measured against the cost of safety measures. The ship may be gone, its wreck lying silently beneath the sea, but the voices of those who perished demand to be remembered. Their deaths are not only a statistic, but a lesson, a warning about what happens when societies allow profit to outweigh human dignity. As the years passed after that terrible night of December 20th, 1987, the Doña Paz became more than just a maritime disaster. It became a memory carried in silence, grief, and fragmented recollections. For the families of the victims, remembrance was not just about honoring those who had perished, but also about refusing to let the world forget what happened. Yet, tragically, the Doña Paz remains one of the most forgotten mass casualty events of the 20th century. The struggle to memorialize. Unlike the Titanic, whose wreck became an iconic site of memory, or the Lusitania, which has been immortalized in countless books and films, the Doña Paz had no grand monuments, no Hollywood adaptations, and no large-scale international recognition. In many ways, this reflected the social status of its victims, ordinary Filipinos, most of them poor, whose stories were lost to history. Attempts were made to build memorials in towns most affected by the tragedy, particularly in Catbalogan, Samar, and Tacloban, where many passengers had boarded. Small plaques and annual remembrance masses were organized by local churches. Survivors would gather quietly, often in tears, to light candles and pray. But beyond these intimate acts of remembrance, there was little institutional effort to preserve the story on a national scale. The government held official ceremonies in the immediate aftermath, but over time, attention faded. Political scandals, new tragedies, and shifting priorities buried the Doña Paz in collective amnesia. Even in school history lessons, the disaster was often mentioned only briefly, if at all. For many younger Filipinos, the story of the Doña Paz was something they discovered only accidentally, often through family members who had lived through the grief. The survivors' voices. Survivors became the true keepers of memory. Only about 24 people out of more than 4,300 lived to tell the tale, and their testimonies are some of the most haunting records of the event. Many spoke of jumping into flaming waters, of clinging to debris while hearing the screams of thousands fading into the night, of the unbearable silence that followed once the ship and its passengers had disappeared beneath the sea. One survivor, a young man at the time, recalled how he had been forced to push away others clinging to him in the water, knowing he would drown if too many held on. For decades, he lived with guilt, plagued by nightmares. Another survivor, a woman who lost her children and husband, described how she floated for hours, watching bodies around her burn and sink. Her testimony was not just about loss, but about the inhumanity of a disaster that never should have happened. These stories became powerful reminders of resilience, but also of trauma. Many survivors struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, sleepless nights, and a lingering fear of the sea. Some became advocates for ferry safety, speaking at schools and public events, though their voices were often drowned out by indifference. Families left behind. For the families of those who perished, remembrance meant keeping alive the memory of loved ones who had no graves. Most bodies were never recovered. Many families never even received confirmation of death, just the knowledge that their loved ones were aboard. This absence of closure was one of the cruelest aspects of the disaster. In homes across Samar, Leyte, Manila, and beyond, small shrines were built. Photos of sons, daughters, parents, and siblings, framed with flowers and candles. These household memorials became sacred spaces where grief was renewed daily. Mothers continued to cook favorite meals of children who would never come home. Fathers carried ticket stubs or fragments of belongings as if they were holy relics. Some families turned their grief into activism. They lobbied for stricter safety laws, for public memorials, for recognition of the tragedy. Others, however, remained silent, too exhausted, too disillusioned after years of ignored petitions and broken promises. Why the world forgot. Part of the tragedy of the Doña Paz lies not only in its scale, but in its erasure from global memory. Unlike the Titanic, whose wealthy passengers ensured worldwide coverage, the Doña Paz victims were ordinary workers, students, and families. The Western media briefly reported on the disaster, but it lacked the glamour, romance, and cultural mythology that made the Titanic endure. Additionally, the absence of a visible wreck and the lack of underwater expeditions meant the story was not continually refreshed for new generations. Without documentaries, blockbuster films, or ongoing archaeological projects, the Doña Paz faded into obscurity outside the Philippines. Modern efforts to remember. In recent years, however, there has been a slow but growing effort to revive the memory of the Doña Paz. Historians, journalists, and maritime researchers have begun to document survivor stories, compile archives, and produce documentaries. Some online platforms and YouTube channels dedicated to maritime history have also covered the event, ensuring that the tragedy reaches a wider audience. In the Philippines, activists have continued to push for a national memorial that properly honors the victims. Though progress has been slow, there is hope that future generations will reclaim the memory of the disaster, not only as a national tragedy, but also as a lesson in accountability and justice. The universal lesson: the legacy of the Doña Paz is not confined to the Philippines. It serves as a warning to all nations that neglecting safety, prioritizing profit, and ignoring the needs of ordinary people can lead to catastrophe. It challenges the world to remember that the deadliest disasters are not always those involving the rich and famous, but often those that silence the voices of the poor. Remembering the Doña Paz is not just about history, it is about humanity. It is about refusing to allow greed and negligence to take precedence over human lives again. It is about ensuring that the thousands who perished are not reduced to a statistic, but are remembered as mothers, fathers, children, workers, and dreamers whose lives were unjustly cut short. Closing reflection. As the waves of Tabla Strait continue to move silently over the wreck of the Doña Paz, the ship rests as a tomb for thousands who never made it home. The sea has claimed their bodies, but memory must claim their dignity. To forget them is to allow history to repeat itself. To remember them is to honor their lives and ensure their deaths are not in vain. And so, every December, when survivors and families gather with candles and prayers, they send a message across time. That the Doña Paz was not just a tragedy of 1987, it is a story that must live on, a warning carried by the sea, a memory carried by the people, and a lesson for the world.